Conservative and your host. Today, we're here to talk about something extremely painful, the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old Black man who was fatally shot on February 23rd of this year when he was out jogging. Ahmaud was chased by two armed white men and shot in broad daylight. Ahmaud's mother, Wanda Cooper Jones, pleaded for answers and action for over 2 months, only after the public outcry following the release of a video recording showing Ahmaud's killing, a video that local law enforcement had in its possession for months for the two men charged in his death. Ahmaud's killing has been called a modern-day lynching, another case where a young Black man was racially profiled, another case of racial violence being carried out under the guise of vigilante justice, and another case where issues of accountability, what public safety means and for whom, and the role of law enforcement are called into serious question. Today, we're joined by an incredible group of people to talk about this tragedy and explore what must change going forward. With us today are the mother of Ahmaud Arbery, Wanda Cooper Jones, the family's lawyer, Lee Merritt. We are also joined by Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey and Representative Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts, both of whom have been fighting to change how law enforcement interacts with and responds to Black communities. Ms. Cooper Jones, it's an honor to be with you. Words can't express how sorry we are for the loss of your son, Ahmaud. My mother wanted me to tell you so many things, but in the interest of time, I want to say we love you and we're praying for you. Thank you for joining us during this important conversation. And I just want to start by asking, how are you doing?
I'm doing better. It's getting better. And thanks for asking. Thank you.
I'm happy to hear that. One of the most troubling aspects of Ahmaud's death is what law enforcement did and did not do right after his death. Your son was killed in February, yet it was only very recently that an outpouring of public concern and pressure led officials in Georgia to move forward in the case and make arrests. Can you describe for us what was happening before this case drew such national attention? And why do you think officials in Georgia previously failed to act?
As soon as it happened, I started reaching out to the local authorities, also to the local DA's office. I want to start by saying that I reached out to them, but initially my phone calls were unanswered. And when I finally talked to the assigned DA at the time, I was told, very little. The information that I was told, the little bit that I was told, that was all the incorrect information. Now that I'm looking back on it. The days were long. I felt like I couldn't find anybody to help me because of the authorities that should have been helping me had failed. It didn't get any national attention until my state council, and they were my voice, because when I was speaking to them in my tone, they failed to hear me at all.
And what was your response initially when they failed to hear you? How did you respond? How did you cope with that situation as a mother?
I just couldn't stop fighting. I had to keep going. My mission was to speak until someone would hear me. And finally someone did.
Thank you for doing that. Members of Congress, the former Vice President Joe Biden, an increasing number of elected officials in Georgia, among others, have spoken out about your son's killing and what a horrific act it was. What do you want to see from elected officials and leaders in Georgia, in Congress, and across the country when it comes to protecting young men of color from being targets of violence?
I would like them to be more involved, to know what's actually happening in these small towns. It's not just in the major cities, but in the small cities, in the small towns where, we don't have a voice there.
We've seen supporters from around the country speaking your son's name and trying to show support for the family. Do you have any words for them right now in this moment to continue to support?
I just want to say I'm very grateful. I'm very appreciative of everyone who's actually supported us. And I want to add that, I'm so appreciative because for so long, for 2 months, there was no support, no support at all.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. Senator Booker, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. I'd like you to weigh in about Ahmaud's life and death. You, Representative Pressley, and more than 80 lawmakers signed a letter to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice calling for a federal investigation into the killing. What have you heard from DOJ, and what do you realistically hope to see will happen?
Well, we've heard nothing back from the DOJ yet, besides that they are taking in all the evidence, I think was the sentence that they used. And so let me just first and foremost say to Ms. Cooper Jones and the whole family, I think the pain and the hurt that America is feeling is just small in comparison to what I imagine you all are going through. And what is frustrating me, and I wrote a column 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago in my college newspaper around the time that the Rodney King beating happened, and said that the everyday experience of young Black men was not even believed until or unless it got caught on videotape. And we know that this would be something that Ms. Cooper Jones might still be fighting if it wasn't for a videotape getting out into the public consciousness. But many of us know that this is the kind of thing that goes on all the time. So first and foremost, we all have a moral obligation to do everything we can to hold to account those people involved in this and those people who tried to potentially cover this up. But then the other thing is we have to realize that this is something that's going on in America all the time. I think that I've had calls where I've seen Black men just break down crying when they think about what happened to Ahmaud, because they know that this is a persistent part of our culture right now that must stop. And so we have to stop being reactive and begin to put forth real societal plan and effort to do the things we know actually work, to start holding police departments accountable and creating more transparency and more oversight, so that this kind of racialized violence becomes a thing in the past in our country.
I totally agree, Cory. I was thinking it took me a long time to watch the video because the level of trauma associated with this type of violence. You feel it very personally. I feel it every time I walk out of my door. And you probably feel the same in Jersey or DC. And my question is, how do we get to a better system of accountability? How do we change and make sure, like you said, 30 years from now, 65 years from Emmett Till's death, we're not still doing this and having this conversation?
Well, we've got to get beyond just rhetoric about this. Many of us have been deploring this darkness for a long time. It's time that people in positions of power begin to take it seriously enough to do action. And I'm going to put myself out there. I was a mayor of New Jersey's largest city, Black man, mayor of a Black city with diversity in our police department. And we thought we were doing things about police accountability, but we weren't doing enough. When the DOJ came in under Obama, when we had an activist DOJ that knew this was a problem, they pulled all of the data out of my city. And you cannot have accountability unless you have transparency, data collect. We don't even collect data nationally on all the police involved shootings. You can't create accountability if you're not even collecting the data. My fellow congresswoman on the phone call, we just on trying to get the CDC to collect data right now on the racial disparities and health outcomes. It's hard to put strategies in place unless you have the data. And so in my time, when they pulled the data out and began to show, working with the ACLU, that there was disparate treatment even in our city. And so this is a challenge we have. Number one is to actually establishing systems of accountability. Accountability is three parts. One is having a standard. We articulate a standard all the time. But the number two part is having ways of measuring that progress toward that standards. And the third part of accountability, which we're fighting for right now in the case of Ahmaud, is consequences when those standards are failed to be met. And the second thing I want to say, because I think it's really important about what actions are we demanding. Now, President Obama actually called together a whole task force after, again, continuous deaths of unarmed Black people in our country. And it was a 21st century task force on policing that had everybody at the table, from Black Lives Matter all the way to big city police chiefs, who put a whole bunch of really constructive recommendations together. They have not been implemented. And so from everything from implicit racial bias, for body cameras, something that these perpetrators of perpetrators in cases across this country, we see often get turned off or what have you. There's got to be processes put into place to create accountability. And the biggest thing that we're demanding right now is a federal civil rights, a Department of Justice civil rights investigation. For them to be hesitating at this point, given the fact pattern that we have, is outrageous and unacceptable in this case. And so I want to see not just justice in this case. We've got to start demanding a process for getting the kind of actions that can help us to start to see the killing of unarmed Black men in this country become a thing of the past, as opposed to something we've been talking about for well over a century, for this whole history of our country.
Thank you for mentioning data and accountability. What we do know is in the United States of America, African Americans are 2.5 more times likely to be killed by police than white people. Another study showed that police kill 2 unarmed Black people in America every week. So we're not just talking about vigilante justice, but also how we handle, as you stated, law enforcement killings. So can you walk us through, from a citizen standpoint, you guys are fighting the good fight in Congress. So like, what can people be doing to help push for this data, accountability, and actual consequences?
Well, again, the potential police misconduct in the killing of an unarmed Black person in our country is rife. And what we see in Ahmaud's case is that these were 2 vigilante folks who then had police departments that seemed to be so quick to want to sweep it under the rug. And so there has to be someone that is investigating this that does not reflect the sort of the racialized environment that we have right now, where, as I think Ms. Cooper-Jones said so well, is in small towns all around America, that blue wall where people just look the other way or try to let these folks off. So there's a whole set of circumstances of where the people investigating police, the people investigating crimes, there has to be some accountability there. Police practices is something that is deeply problematic in America, and I've learned this from running a police department. And it's going to take a much bigger commitment on all levels of government to deal with persistent implicit racial bias. In my book, I quoted the then head of the FBI, who admitted, if I'm walking down a street and I have young Black youths on one side and young white youths on the other side, my implicit bias, he said in his speech, would make me think that the young Black kids. We see fear, officers saying that they were afraid for their lives, as justifiable use of force. We've seen now multiple cases of vigilante justice happening because people said they're afraid for their lives. So I just want to say that this is not going to be easy, but we have got to start demanding certain pillars. And I'll say a lot of the laws we now have, so-called stand your ground laws, which have given a lot of justification for the killing of unarmed individuals. The citizens arrest laws that have been written in a way that are trying to use as a shield for the people who are responsible for Ahmaud's death. We have to have a systematic plan. But what is woefully lacking in America right now is, number one, admitting that this is a problem, and then 2, a commitment to do the real things that we know, that police, criminologists, specialists know, from holding prosecutors accountable, and the way we elect prosecutors, all the way to law enforcement officials. And the last thing I want to say, lest people who are watching this think that this is somehow anti-police, it is 100% not that. Let me give you the last example. I'm sorry to go into this level of detail, but what Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing found out is that if you actually start collecting data, there is something called predictive analytics, that there are things that happen to police officers that make it much more likely that they engage in police misconduct. Many of us remember that Texas pool party where a Black 14-year-old girl was sat on by an officer. I still have that stunning image in my mind of a police officer, in my opinion, abusing a child at a pool party. And what they found was one of the pieces of data that is very predictive for officer misconduct is when they're in highly stressful situations like suicides. And that officer, they found out, for example, had 2 suicide calls, but there's no systems with which to pull the officers in to help them with their mental health. I remember running in my police department, there was a horrible incident where there was a hostage situation. I was talking to my police director who was strategizing about how to defuse this hostage situation and get the person with the gun out of the building. And immediately over the phone, I heard gunshots ring. My officers ran into a house, no situational awareness, where gunshots had just gone off. They came up to the top of the steps. They saw a woman dead who had shot herself in the head. But before that, she had put a pillow over her child and shot her child. The officer had to pull back that pillow, try to save that child. Traumatic event. That officer then goes home, and then they come back to work the next day. And so if we don't have systems, and if that officer then pulls somebody over who exercises their First Amendment right and curses at that officer, that's not a justification for abuse or for misuse or what have you. But you can understand that that officer might not conduct themselves in a way that we would want. And so we've got to start creating systems, holistic systems that are beginning to reconnect trust between communities of color and our police departments, where communities can be confident that there is systems that protect them, that there's transparency and accountability, and our police departments who are in stressful situations know that they'll get the mental health support, the implicit bias training, and the other things that can help to make our police departments up for the task of trying to keep true strength and to help to create more beloved communities.
Thank you so much. Representative Pressley, I want to bring you into this conversation. First of all, thank you so much for joining us again on the briefing. Always a pleasure to see you. Let's talk about the system. So Senator Booker is mentioning these systems. Let's talk about that. Like, there's so many troubling aspects of this case. What stands out most to you, and how can we change this for the future?
Sure. Well, before I get into that, if you'll indulge me for a moment, because I do just want to address Ms. Cooper-Jones, and I'm going to ask you to unmute her in a second, because, you know, the other day I was giving a speech, and in the middle of it, I started to cry. And I started to cry because I thought about how I could not ease the ache in my husband, in the Black man that I call my husband. There was nothing that I could offer to comfort him. And what has happened to Ahmaud is yet another demonstration of the callous disregard for Black lives, for Black bodies. And what you've endured, there are no words to offer solace. Ahmaud should not be trending because of the brutal way in which he died. He should be trending for a contribution he made to this world, a cure he discovered, a degree he earned, a child he mentored. And because we are consistently, Black pain is delegitimized, our lives are devalued, and there is this constant fire hose of demoralizing, dehumanizing experiences. And so, to the point of the dehumanization of it, because when they saw Ahmaud, they did not see a man, they did not see a person. There was a presumption of guilt immediately, because there are those that are just resentful that we even exist. We are born criminals in their minds. And so there are no words for you, Ms. Cooper-Jones, because there's no word for this. If a child loses a parent, they are orphaned. If a spouse loses a partner, then they are a widow or a widower. But there is no word for a parent who loses a child, because it is out of order. It is not supposed to happen, and certainly not in such a vile, brutal way like that of what occurred with this lynching by these vigilantes. So I wanted to ask you for a moment before I answer your question, John, Ms. Cooper-Jones. I don't want Ahmaud to be defined wholly by the brutal way in which he died. Since we were robbed of the opportunity for him to be defined by how he lived and what he contributed, if you would just center this conversation and tell us a little bit about Ahmaud, because I would like to carry that with me in this work.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing. Ahmaud was humble. I always begin with that because he was the most humblest individual that you could have met. Ahmaud was kind. Ahmaud was Ahmaud was a good child. He was well mannered. He was his yes ma'am, no ma'am. He was caring. I mean, he was a giver. If he could lend a hand, if he can do anything for you, he would. Ahmaud just was good. I mean, he was my baby, of course, so it's all good things there. But Ahmaud was really a good guy. He was really good.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, so a good man and a giver, and we are being robbed of the contribution of his giving. So what is the thing that stands out to me the most? There are so many egregious things with which that occurred here, but I would say, in general, writ large, it's just the failure of the system. That arrests weren't made until a video of the incident went viral. So, that's not justice. And justice is a living Ahmaud. Justice is a living Breonna Taylor. The nation and the communities, for whom these heinous incidents continue to happen with impunity. We grieve alongside the Arbery family. We grieve with the Taylor family. We grieve with the Reed family. When we have these campaigns saying, say their names, so that we don't become numb to, devastating statistics, but just see only statistics and not the people that were flesh and bone, who loved and were loved, behind that. And, Senator, I don't know if you've ever struggled with this, but I've been, standing at a lectern about to give a speech, and I've said, I want to bring those names into the room. Can you remind me of the name of this young brother and that young sister? And people will confuse and conflate the names because there's so many. Because there are so many. So we are in a constant struggle for justice. But we are going to keep fighting for an America that values our existence and put an end to these systemic injustices that keep robbing us of Black lives. But the thing that sticks out to me the most in this particular instance, I mean, here we are in the midst of, COVID-19, imminent threats all around. And you just feel like Black folks can't catch a break. We're dying disproportionately of COVID-19. You're just trying to navigate, a new normal of just how to stay alive, and just the layered trauma that just keeps coming. And again, for Ahmaud, the rush to judgment, a presumption of guilt, and true justice requires the system to change and to shift our mentality. So we have to ensure that we create space also for women and girls. Far too often our tragedies are met with silence. And there is an epidemic of violence that is robbing us of Black trans women lives as well. So I'd be remiss if I didn't, while we're lifting up Ahmaud and Breonna and Sean, if I didn't also lift up Nina Pop today. But I mean, that's the problem. If we just want to bring those names into every room and say their names to give them the dignity and honor they deserve, we would never stop, because there are so many. So, but that's what sticks out to me the most, is just a Black man jogging and just an immediate presumption of guilt.
Thank you for invoking Ahmaud's memory, and not how he died, but like who he is. And Ms. Cooper Jones, your strength. Representative, I watched you break down once, and I felt that very deeply, because
you were there. Okay, that's right. That's what it was on. Yeah.
And it's very difficult to go on, but I love the work you're doing, and that you are speaking both love and power into existence, but also recognizing the whole community, right? And the fact that we have to do this together. I want to bring in Lee Merritt. And Lee, your work is so special because you're on the front lines as a civil rights attorney. And I'd like you to, for the non-lawyers out there especially, just break down some of the context about what's happening here, and describe, what you've seen so far. What are familiar patterns that are playing out, and what, if anything, is unique in this case?
So I'm often asked, from case to case, we get an extraordinary circumstance where a young man is out jogging and he's literally hunted down by other citizens and he's killed. And they say, isn't this case so different than anything you've done before? And the answer is no. Ahmaud Arbery was criminalized doing something ordinary. Tatiana Jefferson was home playing video games with her nephew, and she left the door open, and criminality was imputed on that situation, and she lost her life. Botham Jean was eating a bowl of ice cream in his own apartment complex, and he was criminalized, sitting at home eating a bowl of ice cream. And the criminalization of those three and so many more was used to justify deadly force being used against them. Now, this is a situation where we have a retired police officer, and you're almost tempted to remove law enforcement behavior out of the situation. But it's so similar to officer-involved shootings, not only in the unjustifiable use of force, but in the legal apparatus response to the use of force. They went ahead and accepted the criminalization label of Ahmaud, and they justified the actions of the vigilantes. And it's so what we see going on is a criminalization of Blackness itself. The people with the guns shooting Ahmaud to death, they weren't criminalized. They were protected by their complexion. But Ahmaud, who was innocent of any wrongdoing, who was engaged in behavior that was common in that community, which was visiting a site under construction, was criminalized. And the truly scary part, the thing that it doesn't make this case different, but it distinguishes it because we get to focus now on the system that bent over backwards to ignore what happened to Ahmaud and to label him a criminal. There are letters from George Barnhill, the district attorney who was appointed to this case, and the Attorney General of Georgia, where George Barnhill tries to explain that Ahmaud has criminals in his family, that his cousin had a criminal record, that maybe his brother had a brush-in with the law. And as a result, the men who killed him should not be held accountable despite seeing the tape, despite the fact that he didn't have any drugs or alcohol in his system, despite the fact that he was not in fact engaged in anything criminal. His life no longer mattered because he was labeled a criminal. And we see this honestly with COVID-19. We're concerned about everyone's lives except for the people we've labeled criminals. And we're going to let them sort of die in prison. We see this happening over and over again. And I think when we get to the root of the problem, in this case in particular, but just in general, in all the cases that I work in, it's the criminalization of Blackness. It's the dehumanization of people who have been labeled criminals and a broken criminal justice system that will justify the death of Black people at the hands of our white counterparts by virtue of them being Black and almost nothing else.
Thank you, Lee. Representative Pressley, I'd like you to respond to that. And I know you have very deep personal experience with the criminal justice system and the way in which it operates. I'd like you to respond to Lee and just, what we can do to really fundamentally reshape these systems that are harming our communities.
Sure, and I think my brother in service, my dear friend and my colleague, who has been such a voice of moral clarity and conviction, and a pace setter when it comes to the work that we need to do to transform our criminal legal system and to truly ensure justice for all. So I just want to acknowledge my brother and just thank him, for his partnership and his leadership. And in terms of what brings me, to this work and why I introduced the People's Justice Guarantee, a radical reimagining of our criminal legal system that begins by centering the humanity of people, are my lived experiences. And again, I'm no anomaly, that's why we keep using words like system and structure and culture, because it's pervasive, right? I'm the child of a formerly incarcerated parent. My father cycled in and out of the criminal legal system for about 14 years. And, one person doesn't just do time. The entire family does that time with them. And certainly my father's incarceration was destabilizing to our household. And my father, I think, is representative of many people who are incarcerated who should not be in jail. My father experienced great trauma throughout his life and was self-medicating that trauma through substance use. And he committed crimes to support that addiction. But my father was no criminal. He was sick. And what he needed and deserved was on-demand, culturally competent treatment, not incarceration. And so when we decriminalize poverty and low-level offenses, when we center the humanity of people, I do think that, ultimately that we could get to decarceration of, 80%, if not higher. And so that's what I've offered with the People's Justice Guarantee, a radical reimagining of our criminal legal system, and many bills in that. So I won't enumerate all of them, but we need a North Star to work towards, because the system needs to be completely dismantled and beginning by centering the dignity of people. We need a framework that is robust and visionary and that is progressive from every single aspect.
Thank you. Senator Booker, can you jump in here and you can respond to those comments either based on your experience as a U.S. Senator, but also, what needs to happen on the state or local level with your experience being a mayor of a city, right? How do we get past this isolated, individualized assessment of wrongdoing, right, and thinking more broadly about these systems that for many years have been, as far as I'm concerned, broken?
Well, I first of all, I just want to thank Congresswoman Pressley, because she really touches on some of the, and Brother Merritt did as well. I mean, the dehumanization of individuals, where you strip them of their humanity and their basic dignity, it penetrates in our society. We see it in our schools, where the same infractions for a Black child versus a white child, the Black child is far more likely to get out of school suspensions, which are far more connected to problems with law enforcement or early dropping out. We just see the devaluing of African-American experiences and humanity. Something else that Congresswoman Pressley has been a leader and a champion on is just this issue of Black maternal mortality, and we see it cutting across. It's not just a condition of low-income women. We see that Black women who bring their pain or their symptoms, they're devalued in a way, their humanity and their symptoms are devalued in a way that are not seen with white women. And that's why you see maternal mortality rates for African-American women 3 or 4 times more. So I could go through all aspects of our society, from healthcare to education. I know the studies that have been done in places like Harvard, where they have the same resume with different pictures to it. Or Harvard did a study on people Black people have criminal convictions, Black people that don't, white people have criminal convictions, white people that don't, same basic resumes. They found out that the order of the hiring was white people with the criminal conviction, then the Black person without the criminal conviction. And so this is a penetrating part of our society that we have to have the courage to first speak the truth of it before we can start dealing with it. And the challenge is, when you get to the criminal justice system, all of those things now have gone on steroids. And I've seen the pain of this in things like marijuana usage, which there's no difference between Blacks or whites. But if you're white, you're much more likely to get a station house adjustment. If you're Black, you're much more likely to end up in jail for long periods of times. And that's why we have, for marijuana crimes, no difference between Blacks and whites. Yet I can't tell you how many Congress people probably have admitted to using marijuana, and how many children in communities of color have done time for that and have no chance of not only going to Congress, but getting a loan from their bank. And so when you see what all the things that have been for Ahmaud, how all of this concentrated down to one deadly moment, where a young man that was so beautifully described by his mother, his humility, his deep kindness, his humanity, that's where we have to start saying, are we going to continue to revisit this time and time again in our society, and also have the painful knowledge? And what hurts me about this every time I think about Ahmaud is I know that there are thousands of Ahmauds out there that we do not talk about. And so the last thing I want to say on a federal level, we have an anti-lynching bill introduced in the House, introduced in the Senate. A congressman back around 1900 introduced that bill. during a time of great terror, thousands of Black Americans thousands of them, through all generations, have been lynched in racially motivated crimes. And just even getting something like that done has been so much more of a chore and a trial, because people are not admitting that these crimes even still go on until they burst into the consciousness, and we get suddenly these household names. And again, the congressman said it so right. I don't want this beautiful young man to be known for his death. I want him to be known for his life. And to prevent this, to honor him now is to have a larger societal conviction, to do the pragmatic things that speak this as a problem and take actions to correct them. It's not like we don't know how to address these things. It's that we do not have a conviction yet in our society to make change so.
Absolutely. Lee, you have been fighting with your team on the legal system level, but I also know Just Georgia, for example, is a coalition demanding systemic change. As an attorney, what's on your wish list to change in ways that folks in Georgia and nationally can plug in to start changing these systems?
So Brother Booker said it best. They use the word dismantle of our current system, and it has to be that intentional. I want to be specific. The system of mass incarceration, where we took a group of people, mostly Black and Latino, and we took their actions and we made it criminal. It wasn't criminal before. My father was also recently released from incarceration after serving over 20 years behind bars. And it's for drugs, right? And that drug issue that he has, that he struggles with, that he's been released and gone back in prison and out of prison about, was a sickness. It wasn't a depraved mind. It was somebody who needed help. And so there was a period in our history, and in our recent history, where Americans began to criminalize poverty and sickness and fill up our prisons. Our prisons exploded over the past 30 to 40 years to this, not only the largest system of mass incarceration in the world, but in world history. No country has ever locked up so many of its citizens. And it was done by the passage of laws, of new, more complicated laws that made it easier to lock up Black and Latino people. And they called it a war on drugs, so it was really a war on Black and brown communities. That war never ended. And if we want to see this change, if we want to see people like Ahmaud no longer criminalized and shot on the streets, we need to dismantle the system that does exist. That means going back and re-examining those laws and taking them apart and putting in new laws that make this, that fix, and I hesitate to say the word fix because it's not broken, but that completely dismantles and replaces this system. Until we do that, we're going to see this over and over again. In the case of Ahmaud, we have a chance now to look at not only the behaviors of a bad cop or the behaviors of a bad police department, but of a district attorney and of another district attorney and other counties coordinating. And so we actually get to look at the system in Ahmaud's case. And the DOJ has the opportunity to go in to South Georgia and point out the glaring hypocrisies, the breakdowns in the judicial system. And we should all look at that and then say, that's not just South Georgia, because the same thing is going on in Texas and in California and in New York, and they all need a deep dive. And I appreciate Brother Booker referring to what the Obama administration was doing with their proactive attorney general, who was going around examining these smaller counties, because that's exactly what we need. We need an active dismantling of these systems that exist all over the country. And I don't want people to be fooled into thinking that it's constrained to the South, because it is not. My office represents people from Chicago to Missouri to New York, and it's the same case every time. A beautiful, unarmed, intelligent Black person is criminalized in a situation that is completely mundane. And the criminal justice system goes to work to justify their murder and to exonerate the killer over and over and over again. And the laws, the very laws that exist on the book, serves to protect them. We need to change those laws, or this will continue to happen.
Thank you, brother. I'm looking forward to continuing that fight with you. Ms. Cooper-Jones, do you have anything you want to share with the world before we wrap up? I think you're muted.
I just want to say thank you to everybody on the panel, Congresswoman Ms. Pressley, Senator Booker. Special thank you to Mr. Mayor for being my voice when I had no voice. Thank you. Thank you for standing with me. Thank you.
And thank you. I want to sincerely thank all of you for joining us. It's clear that we want to see the killers of Ahmaud Arbery held accountable for the trauma they've inflicted on our communities. But as a community, we must also respond to the multiple systemic ills inflicting violence on our communities on a daily basis. So Ms. Cooper-Jones, please know our thoughts and prayers are with you during this time. Mr. Merritt, thank you for pursuing justice for Ahmaud and the family. Senator Booker and Representative Pressley, thank you for fighting and continuing to fight for justice reform in Congress. Please stay healthy and safe this weekend, y'all. And see you next time on The Briefing.